The 25th of October, 1957, Manhattan. Inside the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel, Albert Anastasia is doing something almost ordinary. He is sitting in a barber chair. A towel is wrapped around him. His hands are occupied by nothing more dangerous than a newspaper and the routine of a haircut. For a man whose name has been connected for decades to murder, waterfront violence, union racketeering, and the enforcement arm of organized crime, it is an unusually vulnerable position. Anastasia has survived death sentences, murder accusations, government investigations, gang wars, and the collapse of the killing network newspapers called Murder Incorporated. He has risen from immigrant longshoreman to underboss, then to boss of one of New York's major Mafia families. Men have disappeared after crossing people in his orbit. Witnesses have changed their stories. Prosecutors have watched cases dissolve. Rivals have learned that challenging him could carry consequences measured in blood. But this morning, none of that history is visible in the mirror. Then two men enter the shop. They move quickly. Their faces are obscured. Guns come out. The barbers scatter. Anastasia has almost no time to react. Shots tear through the room. According to later accounts, he lunges toward the mirror, perhaps mistaking the reflections of his attackers for the men themselves. It is one of the most repeated images in Mafia history. The so-called Lord High Executioner rising from a barber chair toward killers he cannot reach. Seconds later, Albert Anastasia is on the floor. The gunmen escape. Weapons are discarded nearby. The assassination becomes front-page news, but the murder itself is never officially solved. That uncertainty is appropriate, because Anastasia's entire career had been built inside the space between what everyone suspected and what prosecutors could actually prove. He had been repeatedly linked to killings without conviction. He had been associated with the Brooklyn crews later labeled Murder Incorporated. But the organization was never as simple as the corporate nickname suggested. He had been suspected in the disappearance of his own boss, Vincent Mangano, but no body was ever found, and no murder charge followed. He had become a major force on the New York waterfront, where control over labor, hiring, strikes, trucking, and cargo could translate into money and influence far beyond a single neighborhood. And by 1957, he stood at the center of a power struggle involving some of the most important names in American Mafia history: Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Carlo Gambino. Each represented a different kind of power. Costello cultivated political relationships. Genovese wanted command. Gambino waited. Anastasia relied on fear. That fear had carried him farther than almost anyone could have predicted. It had helped turn a dock worker from Calabria into a syndicate-level enforcer. It had helped him survive the downfall of men around him. It had helped him rise when others disappeared. But fear creates obedience more easily than loyalty. By the time Anastasia sat in that barber chair, more than one powerful man had reason to benefit from his death. Genovese wanted to eliminate a major obstacle. Gambino stood to inherit Anastasia's family. Other leaders had reasons to question whether Anastasia's temper, independence, and reputation for uncontrolled violence were becoming liabilities. The precise conspiracy remains debated, and the identities of the two gunmen were never established in court. But the result was unmistakable. A man who had spent much of his adult life making other people vulnerable had finally entered a room where he was vulnerable himself. His body lay beneath the mirrors while the killers disappeared into New York. To understand how Albert Anastasia became important enough to require an assassination this dramatic, we have to go back more than 3 decades before Murder Incorporated, before the waterfront empire, before the Mangano family, and before the name Anastasia inspired fear. We have to begin with a young immigrant named Alberto Anastasia, a laborer who arrived in America and learned very early that a murder case is only as strong as the witnesses willing to speak. Alberto Anastasia was born in 1,902 inches, Tropea, a coastal town in Calabria, southern Italy, into a family far removed from the criminal mythology that would later surround his name. He came from a working-class background, and, like many young men from southern Italy in the early 20th century, looked toward the United States as a place where labor could become opportunity. When he arrived in America, he did not step directly into the Mafia. He entered the world of work. New York's waterfront needed strong backs, quick hands, and men willing to accept dangerous conditions for irregular pay. Longshore work was physically punishing and brutally competitive. Ships arrived, carrying cargo worth fortunes, but the men unloading them could wait for hours, hoping to be chosen for a day's wages. Hiring was unstable, favoritism was common, and the line separating labor organization from intimidation was often thin. For a young immigrant with little institutional protection, the docks could teach several lessons at once. Strength mattered, connections mattered more, and the ability to make other men afraid could become a form of economic security. Anastasio adapted quickly. Somewhere along the way, the name became Anastasia, and Umberto increasingly became Albert. But the most important transformation was not linguistic, it was behavioral. Violence entered his life early, and with consequences that should have ended his story before it truly began. In 1921, Anastasia was convicted of murder in New York and sentenced to death. He was still a young man, and now he was facing the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. It is one of the great reversals in his biography that the future mafia boss, who would eventually die in a barber chair, first came terrifyingly close to dying under state authority decades earlier. But the conviction did not hold. Anastasia received a new trial. The prosecution's case weakened, and the principal witness was no longer available in the same way. He was eventually acquitted. The details surrounding the collapse of the case have been retold many times and often embellished. So the safest conclusion is also the most revealing. A murder conviction that had once placed Anastasia on death row disappeared when the testimony supporting it could no longer carry the case. That lesson would have been impossible for him to miss. The state could accuse, a jury could convict, a judge could pronounce death. But if witnesses vanished, recanted, refused to cooperate, or could not be produced, the system could break. Anastasia would encounter that pattern again. Over the years, he was arrested or suspected in connection with violent crimes more than once, and prosecutions repeatedly struggled when witnesses became unavailable or unwilling to testify. It would be careless to claim that Anastasia personally intimidated every person who failed to appear. The evidence does not support that kind of omniscient certainty. What matters is that he lived inside a criminal environment where witness silence had measurable value. A man could survive a murder accusation if the people who knew what happened no longer helped the government prove it. That principle would become central to the kind of power Anastasia later represented. He was not simply learning that violence could remove an enemy. He was learning that fear could reshape the legal process surrounding violence. At the waterfront, those lessons had commercial applications. A worker who feared losing his place in the hiring line could be controlled. A union official who feared a beating could be controlled. An employer who feared a strike, sabotage, theft, or disruption could be controlled. And a witness who feared what might happen after speaking could be controlled most effectively of all. Anastasia did not yet command an organization capable of applying that pressure systematically, but he was entering the perfect environment in which to learn how. The docks were not merely a workplace. They were a choke point connecting ships, cargo, unions, employers, trucking companies, warehouses, and millions of dollars in commerce. Anyone able to influence the men who moved that cargo could influence far more than a few blocks of waterfront. Albert Anastasia had already survived the state's attempt to execute him. Now he was moving toward an industry where intimidation could generate money every day, and where the difference between a laborer and a racketeer depended less on who worked the docks than on who could control the men waiting to work them. New York's waterfront was not just a line of piers. It was one of the most important economic choke points in the country. Every ship that entered the harbor carried cargo that had to pass through a chain of human decisions before it could reach a warehouse, a factory, a wholesaler, or a store. Longshoremen unloaded the vessels. Hiring bosses decided who worked. Union officials could influence access to jobs. Stevedoring companies competed for contracts. Truckers waited for cargo. Warehouse operators depended on predictable schedules. If one part of that chain stopped, everything behind it began losing money. That made the waterfront uniquely vulnerable to organized coercion. A criminal did not need to own a ship to profit from shipping. He did not need to own a warehouse to influence what entered it. He did not need to employ every longshoreman to control whether cargo moved. He only needed enough influence over the men and institutions positioned at the bottleneck. For workers, the old hiring system could be brutally insecure. Men often gathered at the docks hoping to be selected for a shift, a system commonly associated with the shape-up, where employment could depend on favoritism, personal connections, kickbacks, or obedience to the right people. If a hiring boss controlled access to work, he controlled whether a man earned wages that day. If a union official controlled membership or assignments, he could reward friends and punish enemies. If gangsters stood behind those officials, the difference between labor discipline and extortion could disappear quickly. Albert Anastasia understood this environment because he had come through it. He knew how valuable fear could become when attached to employment. And as his influence grew, his younger brother, Anthony Anastasio, known as Tough Tony, became an important figure in the International Longshoremen's Association. The brothers did not need to occupy identical roles. Albert's reputation was built around underworld violence and enforcement. Anthony's position placed him closer to the formal union structure. Together they represented the kind of relationship that made waterfront racketeering so difficult to separate from legitimate commerce. Employers needed labor. Workers needed jobs. Union officers could influence both. Criminal figures could pressure the union, intimidate rivals, offer strike-breaking muscle, enforce agreements, protect theft, and make problems disappear for businesses willing to cooperate. Money could be extracted from several directions at once. A worker desperate for favorable assignments might pay for access. A businessman threatened with disruption might pay for peace. Cargo theft could be organized or tolerated. Loans could be extended at brutal interest rates to men whose incomes were uncertain. Trucking routes could become pressure points. A strike threat could be more profitable than an actual strike, because the possibility of losing days of commerce might convince an employer to settle before the first picket line appeared. This was the same economic principle Lepke Buchalter had exploited in the garment industries. Disruption had value because someone could charge to prevent it. But on the waterfront, the scale was larger and more physical. Cargo arrived every day. Ships could not wait indefinitely. Perishable goods could spoil. Commercial schedules could collapse. Even a relatively small group of men positioned correctly could impose costs on companies far larger than themselves. Anastasia's reputation for violence amplified that leverage. Federal investigators would later describe him as a major figure associated with waterfront rackets, strong-arm activity, and strike-breaking. Those descriptions matter because they reveal that his power was not simply based on a collection of murder stories. His criminal importance came from the intersection of violence and infrastructure. If a gangster controls an illegal gambling room, he controls a business. If he can influence the labor force, unloading one of the busiest ports in the world, he can influence a system on which countless legal businesses depend. That distinction helped elevate Anastasia beyond the level of a neighborhood enforcer. The waterfront also produced another valuable asset: information. Dock workers saw cargo. Hiring bosses knew schedules. Truckers knew destinations. Union men knew which employers were vulnerable. Thieves could learn when valuable shipments were arriving. Criminal crews could exploit that knowledge for hijacking or pilferage. Employers who wanted uninterrupted operations might tolerate arrangements they would never admit publicly. Police corruption and political protection could add another layer of security. None of this required one centralized conspiracy controlling every pier. The waterfront was too complex for that. Influence could be fragmented among locals, companies, criminal groups, politicians, and individual racketeers. But fragmentation did not make the system harmless. It created opportunities for men skilled at navigating overlapping interests. Anastasia was becoming one of those men. He could move between street violence, union leverage, and higher-level organized crime because each world needed something the others could provide. Employers wanted stability. Corrupt labor figures wanted protection. Gangsters wanted revenue. Political allies wanted influence. Workers wanted jobs. Anastasia's power grew in the spaces where those needs collided, and violence was the guarantee behind the arrangement. Most of the time, the threat of violence was more useful than violence itself. A dead employer could not continue paying. A destroyed peer could not generate income. An endless strike could reduce everybody's profits. Effective racketeering required calibrated pressure. One beating could discipline dozens of men. One stolen shipment could convince a company that cooperation was cheaper than resistance. One vanished dissident could make an entire local reconsider its loyalties. That was the environment in which Albert Anastasia's reputation hardened. The man who had once survived a murder conviction was now becoming someone whose name could influence decisions without his physical presence. But waterfront power alone could only take him so far. To rise inside the Italian-American underworld, he needed something larger than control over labor. He needed a political revolution inside the Mafia itself. That opportunity arrived at the beginning of the 1930s, when two generations of New York gangsters went to war, and younger criminals began deciding that the old bosses were standing in the way of a more profitable future. Albert Anastasia would not remain a dockside enforcer for long. The Costello War was about to give him a path into the highest level of organized crime. The Costello War gave Albert Anastasia exactly the kind of environment in which a violent specialist could become politically valuable. By 1930, New York's Italian-American underworld was divided by a struggle between the forces associated with Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. The conflict was not simply a feud between two men. It reflected a deeper argument over who would control the city's criminal economy and whether younger gangsters would continue serving older bosses who treated power as personal territory. Men such as Charles Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and others increasingly saw endless warfare as bad business. Prohibition had created fortunes large enough to reward cooperation across ethnic and neighborhood lines, and the younger generation wanted a system that could settle disputes without destroying revenue every time a boss felt insulted. Anastasia fit naturally into that transition because he offered something the political organizers needed: disciplined violence. Later, accounts repeatedly place him among the gunmen involved in the April 1931 assassination of Joe Masseria at a Coney Island restaurant, although the precise list of shooters varies across sources and cannot be treated as forensically certain. What is clear is that Masseria's death removed one side of the war and helped clear the way for Luciano and his allies. Maranzano briefly emerged as the dominant figure, but his victory lasted only months. In September 1931, Maranzano was murdered in his Manhattan office, and the old war finally collapsed. Luciano and his allies then helped build a new structure for New York organized crime, one designed less around a single supreme boss and more around separate families, territories, negotiated interests, and what became known as the Commission. For Anastasia, this restructuring was an enormous opportunity. Under Vincent Mangano, the organization that would later become the Gambino family took shape as one of the major New York families. Anastasia rose beneath Mangano and eventually became underboss. His waterfront power made him economically useful. His reputation for violence made him strategically useful. And his relationships across the Luciano-era network connected him to men whose ambitions extended far beyond Brooklyn. This was also the period in which Anastasia became permanently linked to the phenomenon later labeled Murder, Incorporated. The name makes the system sound cleaner than it was. There was no publicly chartered company, no single office, and no universally agreed organizational chart. The term was created by the press to describe overlapping groups of professional killers and intermediaries associated with syndicate figures, many of them operating out of Brooklyn neighborhoods such as Brownsville and Ocean Hill. Lepke Buchalter was strongly associated with the managerial and contract side of that network. Anastasia was associated with the enforcement side and with access to men who could carry out killings on assignment. In later FBI summaries, he would be described in dramatic language as a leading execution figure tied to the Brooklyn troops. The important point is not the nickname. It is the function. Organized crime had learned that murder could be outsourced. A boss who wanted someone eliminated did not necessarily need to use his own soldiers. Orders could move through intermediaries to killers whose involvement was difficult to trace back to the original decision. For a man like Anastasia, whose career already depended on fear, the system increased his importance. He was no longer merely useful on the waterfront. He was useful to the architecture of organized crime itself, but the same system that created his reputation nearly destroyed him. In 1940, Abe "Kid Twist" Reles, one of the most feared killers associated with the Brownsville crews, began cooperating with prosecutors. Reles possessed exactly the kind of knowledge that made a professional assassin dangerous when he stopped being loyal. He could describe old murders, identify intermediaries, and explain relationships that had previously existed only as rumor. His testimony helped prosecutors dismantle sections of the killing network and contributed to the cases that sent several men to prison or the electric chair. More dangerously for Anastasia, Reles was expected to provide evidence that could implicate him in murder. Suddenly, a man who had survived prosecution, partly because witnesses had failed to carry cases, was facing the ultimate version of the same problem. A witness who understood how organized killing worked from the inside. Reles never gave that testimony in court. In November 1941, while being guarded by police at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, he fell from a sixth-floor window and died. The death immediately generated suspicion because the timing was extraordinary. A protected witness with knowledge of powerful gangsters had somehow gone out a window while surrounded by law enforcement. Rumors of bribery and murder spread quickly, but suspicion is not proof. A later grand jury concluded that Reles died accidentally while attempting to escape or move along the exterior of the building, and no court established that Anastasia ordered his death. The mystery survived because the circumstances were too convenient for the underworld to ignore. For Anastasia, however, the practical result was clear. One of the most dangerous witnesses against him was gone, and he avoided the fate that consumed Lepke, Buchalter, and several Murder Incorporated killers. This was the second major false ending of his life. A murder conviction had once put him on death row, and he escaped it. The collapse of Murder Incorporated appeared capable of dragging him down, and he survived again. Men around him were executed, while his position remained intact. By the early 1940s, Albert Anastasia had learned a lesson that could easily become poisonous for any criminal leader. Every time the system seemed ready to destroy him, someone else fell first. Surviving danger strengthened his reputation, but it also encouraged the belief that he was uniquely untouchable. The next decade would show how dangerous that belief could become. Because Anastasia was no longer satisfied with being the man bosses used when they needed someone removed. He was moving toward a position where he no longer wanted to serve the boss at all. World War II gave Albert Anastasia something few men with his record could have expected: a path toward legitimacy. By the early 1940s, he was already deeply embedded in New York's underworld, associated with waterfront rackets, union violence, and the network prosecutors had connected to Murder Incorporated. Yet the war transformed the strategic importance of the docks. The Port of New York became essential to the movement of troops, supplies, fuel, and military cargo, and the federal government became intensely concerned about sabotage, labor disruption, and security along the waterfront. Organized crime figures later claimed a role in helping keep the docks stable, and stories surrounding Luciano, Anastasia, and wartime cooperation eventually grew into one of the most mythologized chapters in Mafia history. There is evidence that government officials made use of underworld contacts connected to the waterfront, but later retellings often inflate how centralized or decisive that cooperation really was. Anastasia's personal role should therefore be treated cautiously. What is documented is that he entered the United States Army in 1942, served as a technical sergeant, helped train soldiers in longshore operations, and became a naturalized American citizen in 1943, before receiving an honorable discharge in 1944. The transformation was remarkable. The immigrant who had once sat under a death sentence at Sing Sing was now wearing an American uniform and holding citizenship. But military service did not pull him away from organized crime for long. After the war, Anastasia returned to the same underworld structure. Only now he possessed greater prestige, stronger alliances, and a reputation for having survived every major threat placed in front of him. The central obstacle above him was still Vincent Mangano. Mangano had been boss of the family since the Luciano-era reorganization of the early 1930s, while Anastasia served beneath him as underboss. On paper, the hierarchy was clear. In practice, the relationship deteriorated. Mangano represented formal authority inside the family. Anastasia possessed his own power base through the waterfront, his alliances with figures such as Frank Costello, and his reputation for violence. The two men increasingly distrusted one another, and that distrust was structurally dangerous because an underboss with independent resources could appear less like a subordinate and more like a rival government. Mangano reportedly resented Anastasia's close relationships with leaders outside the family, and may have viewed his autonomy as a threat. Anastasia, for his part, had every reason to suspect that a boss who no longer trusted him could eventually decide to remove him. In the Mafia, that kind of relationship rarely remains frozen. Someone eventually acts first. In April 1951, the balance changed dramatically. Philip Mangano, Vincent's brother and an important figure in the family, was found murdered in Brooklyn. Vincent Mangano disappeared and was never seen again. His body was never recovered. Suspicion immediately fell on Anastasia, and later Mafia accounts would often treat the episode as an internal coup. But no court proved that Anastasia ordered either man killed, and he was never convicted or even formally charged with their deaths. What followed, however, is beyond dispute. Anastasia emerged as the new boss. That created a serious political problem inside the Mafia's governing system. If an underboss could eliminate his superior and simply inherit the family, the commission's rules meant very little. Anastasia needed legitimacy from other powerful leaders, not because they could erase the suspicion, but because their recognition could stabilize his position. Frank Costello became crucial. Costello, then one of the most politically connected and influential bosses in New York, supported Anastasia's claim that Mangano had been planning to kill him and that he had acted in self-defense or anticipation of danger. Whether every detail of that explanation was true mattered less than the fact that Costello backed him. Anastasia was accepted as boss. The enforcer had reached the throne. He now controlled the organization that would later become known as the Gambino crime family, though no one in 1951 could know whose name history would eventually attach to it. The promotion seemed to prove everything Anastasia had learned about power. Survive the indictment, survive the witness, survive the gang war, survive the boss. Each crisis removed someone else and left Albert higher, but becoming boss changed the mathematics around him. As an enforcer, his violence had made him valuable because other men could direct it. As a boss, the same violence made him harder to control. His friendships with Costello and other powerful figures gave him protection, but they also placed him inside broader rivalries. Beneath him, ambitious men watched. Above and around him, other bosses calculated. And inside his own family, Carlo Gambino was rising quietly, without Anastasia's theatrics, without his temper, and without the same need to remind people why they should be afraid. Albert Anastasia had finally become the man no one inside his family was supposed to challenge. That was exactly when challenging him became most profitable. By the mid-1950s, Albert Anastasia had reached the most dangerous stage of a criminal career, the point where power and vulnerability begin to look exactly the same. As boss, he controlled a major New York Mafia family, retained influence on the waterfront, and carried a reputation built over decades of violence, survival, and underworld enforcement. Yet the qualities that had made him invaluable as an enforcer were becoming liabilities at the top. An underboss could be useful because he frightened people. A boss had to do more than frighten them. He had to keep allies calm, subordinates loyal, and other families convinced that his judgment was predictable enough to live with. Anastasia's reputation did not always inspire that kind of confidence. One of the most disturbing stories attached to his leadership involved Arnold Schuster, a young Brooklyn clothing salesman who became briefly famous in 1952 after helping police identify fugitive bank robber Willie Sutton. Schuster had recognized Sutton on the street, contacted authorities, and cooperated with the police. Less than a month later, Schuster was shot to death near his home. At the time, the murder shocked New York because the victim was not a gangster, rival racketeer, or criminal witness inside an underworld feud. He was a civilian who had helped capture a wanted bank robber. The killing remained unsolved. Years later, Mafia informant Joseph Valachi claimed that Anastasia had ordered Schuster killed after seeing him celebrated publicly and reacting with fury toward anyone he considered an informer. That allegation became one of the most repeated stories about Anastasia, but it was never proved in court, and contemporary investigators did not establish a direct case against him. The distinction matters. What is documented is Schuster's cooperation and murder. What came later was an allegation that reinforced an already terrifying picture of Anastasia as a man whose hatred of informers could exceed rational business calculation. Whether the story was true in every detail or not, the damage to Anastasia's reputation inside organized crime came from the possibility that it could be true. Bosses could tolerate violence that protected revenue, violence that seemed impulsive, personal, or unnecessary was different. It created police attention without creating profit. It frightened allies as much as enemies, and it raised the possibility that the man giving orders could become unpredictable. At the same time, government pressure was increasing around Anastasia's legitimate status and waterfront connections. Congressional investigations into organized crime had helped turn the Mafia from an underworld secret into a national political issue. New York's docks came under heavier scrutiny as investigators examined corruption, union abuses, hiring practices, and criminal influence along the port. Anastasia also faced legal pressure over his naturalization. Federal authorities argued that he had concealed parts of his arrest history when he became a citizen during the war. A court initially moved to revoke his citizenship, though that judgment was later reversed on appeal, and the effort did not remove him from the country. Even when Anastasia survived legally, each investigation chipped away at the sense that he could operate beyond consequence. The pattern of his life was repeating. Accusation, pressure, survival. But survival was becoming less reassuring because the threats were no longer coming only from prosecutors. They were forming inside the Mafia itself. Frank Costello remained one of Anastasia's most important allies, and that alliance placed him directly against Vito Genovese, who had spent years waiting for an opportunity to seize greater control of the family organization associated with Luciano and Costello. Genovese understood the obstacle in front of him. Removing Costello would be difficult, as long as Anastasia remained powerful enough to retaliate. Anastasia was not merely Costello's friend. He was a physical counterweight, a boss with men, territory, and the kind of reputation that made any move against his allies potentially expensive. That made him strategically important, but it also made him strategically disposable if the right coalition could be assembled. Beneath Anastasia sat Carlo Gambino. Gambino represented almost the opposite personality. Where Anastasia's power was visible in his reputation for violence, Gambino cultivated patience, relationships, and the ability to appear less threatening than his ambitions actually were. He did not need to challenge Anastasia publicly. He needed to survive him. Every investigation, every rumor of reckless violence, every conflict with another boss increased the value of waiting. If Anastasia fell, Gambino was positioned close enough to benefit. By 1956 and 1957, the board was beginning to align around a simple fact. Several powerful men had different reasons to want Albert Anastasia weakened, and some had reasons to want him dead. Genovese wanted to neutralize Costello's strongest ally. Gambino could inherit a family. Other bosses had reason to distrust a leader whose violent reputation threatened stability. Anastasia still looked formidable from the outside. He had survived death row, murder incorporated, Mangano's disappearance, and repeated government pressure. But this time, survival had created a different problem. Too many people understood that he was dangerous, and too many of them could profit if somebody else removed him first. The man who had spent his career calculating how fear changed other people's decisions was about to discover what happened when an entire criminal board began making the same calculation about him. In 1957, the struggle around Albert Anastasia stopped being a collection of private rivalries and became a contest over the future leadership of the New York Mafia. 4 men stood at the center of the board, and each represented a different method of surviving organized crime. Frank Costello relied on political relationships, quiet influence, and decades of connections that reached beyond the underworld. Vito Genovese wanted direct command and had spent years waiting for an opportunity to push Costello aside. Albert Anastasia represented coercive power, the ally whose reputation made attacking Costello more dangerous because retaliation could come from an entire crime family. And beneath Anastasia stood Carlo Gambino, a patient subordinate who had little reason to challenge his boss openly when time might do the work for him. For Genovese, the strategic problem was obvious. Costello could be weakened politically, but as long as Anastasia remained strong, removing him risked provoking a larger conflict. Then, on the night of the 2nd of May, 1957, Costello entered the lobby of his apartment building on Central Park West. A gunman followed. A shot struck Costello in the head, grazing rather than killing him. The alleged shooter was Vincent Chin Gigante, a Genovese loyalist. Costello survived, but the message was unmistakable. He understood that remaining at the center of power could invite another attempt, and he effectively withdrew from active leadership. Genovese had removed one major obstacle without creating the public spectacle of a successful assassination. For Anastasia, however, Costello's retreat was disastrous. The alliance that had helped legitimize his rise after Vincent Mangano disappeared was suddenly weaker. The political shield around him had cracked. Now Anastasia stood more exposed than at any point since becoming boss. Genovese had every reason to view him as the next obstacle. Gambino had every reason to wait. Other mafia leaders could look at Anastasia's reputation for volatility and wonder whether removing him might produce a more stable arrangement. There is no courtroom record that gives us a perfect transcript of the conspiracy that followed. The most widely accepted historical interpretation places Genovese and Gambino on the same side of the calculation, though the precise planning, intermediaries, and gunmen remain disputed. What can be reconstructed with confidence is that Anastasia's death benefited both men. Genovese could eliminate Costello's most dangerous ally. Gambino could rise inside Anastasia's organization. And unlike a public gang war, a carefully executed assassination could change leadership before anyone had time to respond. On the morning of October 25, Anastasia traveled into Manhattan and entered the barbershop inside the Park Sheraton Hotel. The setting mattered because it stripped away the environment that normally protected a boss. A restaurant table could be watched by bodyguards. A social club could be filled with loyal men. A car could move. But a barber chair required stillness. Anastasia removed his outer defenses and sat beneath a cape while a barber worked around him. His bodyguard was not positioned beside him at the crucial moment. Then 2 men entered. Their faces were partially concealed. Pistols appeared. The first shots shattered the ordinary rhythm of the room. Barbers and customers scattered. Anastasia rose instinctively from the chair. In one of the most famous details attached to the killing, he reportedly moved toward the mirror, reacting to the reflections of the men firing behind him. Whether every second unfolded exactly as later accounts describe is impossible to know, but the symbolic image endured because it seemed written for his career. The man associated for decades with anonymous killers was facing assassins whose real faces he could barely see. The gunmen continued firing until Anastasia collapsed. Then they left. They did not remain to announce a faction or claim responsibility. Weapons connected to the episode were reportedly discarded, and the killers disappeared into a city filled with men who knew the underworld had just changed. Anastasia was dead at 55. The assassination became one of the most iconic murders in American Mafia history, and one of the most enduring unsolved crimes of the era. Various theories later named different shooters, including men associated with Brooklyn crews and figures linked to the Gallo faction, but none of those identities was established in court. The more important question was not who physically pulled the triggers, it was who benefited. Vito Genovese had now seen both Costello and Anastasia removed from active power within a matter of months. Carlo Gambino was positioned to succeed Anastasia and take control of the family. The man who had spent years appearing less threatening than the boss above him was suddenly standing at the top. Anastasia's killing, therefore, looks less like an isolated revenge murder than the final move in a broader redistribution of power. His death also completed the central irony of his career. He had survived a death sentence because a prosecution weakened. He had survived the collapse of Murder Incorporated when witnesses disappeared or died. He had survived the disappearance of Vincent Mangano and turned that crisis into promotion. Every previous threat had left him stronger. But becoming boss changed the incentives around him. The higher he climbed, the more valuable his death became to other ambitious men. Fear could compel obedience from below, but it could not stop allies from calculating that a different leader might be better for business. And on the 25th of October, 1957, the calculation finally moved against Albert Anastasia. The Lord High Executioner had become somebody else's contract. Yet even this assassination did not produce the clean victory Vito Genovese may have imagined. Anastasia was gone, Costello was retreating, and Genovese appeared closer than ever to supremacy. But the man who inherited Anastasia's organization was not Genovese. It was Carlo Gambino, and only weeks later, another gathering in a small town in upstate New York would turn Genovese's apparent triumph into one of the Mafia's greatest public embarrassments. Albert Anastasia's assassination solved one problem for Vito Genovese, but it created a different kind of winner. Carlo Gambino moved into the leadership of Anastasia's organization, and, over time, the family would become known by Gambino's name rather than Anastasia's. That change alone tells us something about how completely power had shifted. Anastasia had ruled through reputation, waterfront muscle, and the fear attached to decades of violence. Gambino's rise represented a quieter model. He understood that survival at the top depended not only on making enemies afraid, but on giving allies fewer reasons to remove you. Genovese, meanwhile, appeared to have cleared the board. Frank Costello had withdrawn after the shooting attempt. Anastasia was dead. Genovese now seemed closer than ever to dominating the Mafia structure around him. Then, only weeks after the Park Sheraton assassination, organized crime suffered one of the most embarrassing public exposures in its history. On the 14th of November 1957, dozens of mob figures traveled to the rural community of Appalachian, New York, for a meeting at the home of Joseph Barbara. Local law enforcement noticed unusual traffic, expensive cars, and men arriving from across the country. Police moved in. Some attendees fled through fields and woods. Others were stopped and questioned. The gathering did not destroy the Mafia, but it shattered the comfortable fiction that nationally connected organized crime was merely a collection of unrelated local gangs. Genovese, who had expected consolidation, instead found himself associated with a disaster that drew federal attention and humiliation. His own reign would not last securely. Within a few years, he would be convicted on narcotics charges and sent to federal prison. The aftermath created an irony even larger than Anastasia's murder. Genovese had helped remove the men standing between him and greater power, yet Carlo Gambino emerged as the more durable beneficiary of 1,957. The organization Anastasia had commended became the Gambino family, and Gambino's patient style proved far better suited to long-term survival than Anastasia's combustible reputation. But the waterfront system that helped create Anastasia did not vanish with his body. Organized crime continued, influencing labor, unions, hiring, trucking, and port commerce for decades. Congressional investigations and later prosecutions would continue documenting Mafia influence around New York and New Jersey docks long after the men who built the earlier system were dead. That is why Albert Anastasia's story cannot be reduced to Murder, Incorporated, or to a famous photograph of a corpse beneath a barber chair. His career connects several stages of American organized crime: immigrant street violence, labor racketeering, the economic power of the waterfront, the Luciano-era restructuring of the Mafia, professionalized enforcement, and the internal politics that eventually produced the Gambino family. Anastasia rose because other powerful men believed his capacity for violence was useful. He survived because witnesses disappeared, cases collapsed, and allies protected him. He became boss because enough people accepted that fear could stabilize an organization. But once he reached the top, the logic reversed. A subordinate feared by everyone can be an asset. A boss feared by everyone can become a common problem. By 1957, Genovese wanted him gone. Gambino stood to inherit. Costello could no longer shield him. Other leaders had little reason to risk themselves to save a man whose removal might make business easier. So Albert Anastasia entered a Manhattan barbershop, believing perhaps that the danger surrounding him could still be managed. Two anonymous gunmen proved otherwise. The mystery of who fired the bullets has survived for generations. The reason Anastasia became vulnerable is easier to understand. He spent his career proving that fear could substitute for loyalty. His assassination proved that it never could.